Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Ozark Mountain history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and what hours of the day or night these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. America was only starting to recover from the severe injuries sustained during the Civil War in 1866. With their thick forests and secret valleys, the Ozark Mountains had long served as a haven for people fleeing some from the law, some from society, and maybe even from their own memories. A land surveyor named Jeremiah Hawkins discovered the remote cabin tucked away in a rocky hollow in April 1869, while surveying the area for a possible railroad expansion in Washington County, Arkansas, close to the western bend of the White River. Locals would later come to refer to the cabin simply as the Boyle place. Despite the spring chill, there was no smoke coming from the chimney, and the tall weeds surrounding the building gave the impression that it had been abandoned for a while. Hawkins would later regret recording that he approached the cabin with professional curiosity rather than any sense of dread, according to his field journal. The door was open and creaked a little in the mountain wind. Hawkins yelled, but got no answer. He went in to note the building on his maps as a matter of habit. He would be plagued by what he found in the Boyle cabin for the rest of his life, and it would eventually become the topic of hushed discussions for decades in Washington County. The cabin's interior was strangely intact, as if its inhabitants had just disappeared while going about their regular lives. Plates with the dried-out remnants of what seemed like a supper were placed on a wooden table for three. In the fireplace, a pot hung over chilly ashes. In the draft, a rocking chair at the window was still swaying a little. However, Hawkins' discovery in the rear chamber prompted him to forsake his survey tools and ride straight to Fayetteville to notify the county sheriff. Along with Hawkins and two deputies, Sheriff Thomas Muldrow entered the cabin, according to the official report he made on the 17th of April, 1869. The document describes the discovery in clinical words that nevertheless express a significant disquiet. It was kept in the Washington County Historical Archives until its contentious removal in 1951. They discovered what looked like a sort of workshop in the back room, with shelves lined with dozens of glass jars, each holding different preserved specimens that Muldrow only described as items of a deeply concerning nature. A large wooden table, its surface stained dark, dominated the center of the room. On a little desk in the corner, dozens of handwritten journals were neatly placed. The sheriff gave his deputies the order to gather the diaries and lock the cabin right away. Days later, a chilling tale of Tobias Boyle and what led him to the isolated hollow in the wake of the war started to surface from the pages of those leather-bound books. Tobias Boyle had bought the land in October 1866, according to county records, paying with gold coins and giving little details about his identity and plans. He came with a male companion whose relationship to Boyle was never explained, and a woman with a haunted face, according to neighbors in the closest settlement, which was about 5 miles away. From November 1866 until February 1869, Boyle's activities were chronicled in the journals in painstaking, unsettling detail. At first, they included ordinary remarks about constructing the hut, hunting, and starting a little garden. However, the entries had changed to something darker by January 1867. Boyle, who described himself in the writings as a former Confederate Army surgeon, started recording what he called the continuation of my research. Unburdened by the short-sighted restrictions of military oversight, Sheriff Muldrow's official report never made clear what this research involved. Journal pages were sealed by court order because they were judged too upsetting to be made public. Testimonies from others who handled the records, however, indicate that Boyle had been engaged in experimental research of some kind, perhaps connected to his wartime experiences. As the months went by, the woman, who was only known in the journals as E., was said to have grown more reclusive and afraid. What wasn't discovered rather than what was the most unsettling part of the case. Despite the fact that the cabin was obviously occupied by 3 people, only 2 sets of personal items were found. The main question that would never be completely addressed was who the third person was and what happened to him. Boyle's journals fell silent after the final dated note on the 22nd of February 1869, which read simply, The patience of observation must yield to the necessity of direct participation. E refuses to acknowledge the potential. Tomorrow, all will be clarified. Despite a thorough search of the surrounding area, no bodies were ever discovered on the property. Only their belongings, and the unsettling proof of whatever activities had occupied their seclusion, remained after the 3 residents of the Boyle cabin had disappeared without a trace. Local authorities attempted to more fully identify the previous tenants after the finding. The trail cooled off after the surrender at Appomattox, but records show that a Tobias Boyle had in fact been a field physician with the 3rd Arkansas Infantry. Between the end of the war and his arrival in the Ozarks, there was no documentation of his whereabouts. Neither the 3rd occupant nor the woman, who was assumed to be E, could be identified. At first, the sheriff's inquiry concentrated on the potential for foul play, presuming that Boyle may have hurt his friends before running away. This notion was refuted, nevertheless, by the absence of any indications of violence within the cabin. Instead of implying a deliberate desertion, the dinner plate implied an abrupt departure or interruption. In his own journal, one of the deputies, James Calloway, wrote that when he got close to the cabin, he felt an unaccountable sensation of heaviness, as though the air itself resisted our presence. Several other members of the search party also reported this feeling, with one man refusing to enter the cabin at all because he felt the threshold push back against my intentions. Sheriff Muldrow dismissed these subjective experiences as superstitious nonsense, but nearly everyone who visited the location in the years that followed made similar reports. The condition of the nearby forest was much more perplexing. Even though the cabin was located in a lush forest, searchers found that there were surprisingly few signs or animal tracks within a 100-yard radius of the building. Had it not been for Dr. William Hawthorne, a Street Louis physician who had become interested in medical procedures during the Civil War, the case could have fallen into local folklore. Hawthorne discovered mentions of the Boyle case in letters to Arkansas officials in 1887 while doing research for a book on war medicine. He was intrigued and went to Fayetteville to look at the evidence that was still there. By this point, villagers had destroyed the cabin because they believed it brought bad luck to the neighborhood. A county court had ordered the destruction of the jars and the majority of the tangible evidence. What was left of the journals, however, after judicious editing, was still preserved in county records. One of the few secondary sources on their contents can be found in Hawthorne's notebooks, to which limited access was permitted. Boyle's works showed a man fascinated with comprehending the basis of human resilience, according to Hawthorne's private correspondence, which was later published in the Journal of Historical Medicine in 1912. According to Hawthorne, who cites the journals, I have become convinced that the conventional understanding of human vitality is fundamentally flawed. Hawthorne observed that Boyle's early entries showed a clinical detachment, but as time went on, a disturbing fervor entered his documentation. He had seen men survive grievous wounds that should have proved fatal, while others died from seemingly minor injuries. As Hawthorne's notes indicate, Boyle had developed theories about consciousness existing in divisible components, with the possibility of isolating and preserving these components under certain conditions. Of particular concern were his observations on what he called the partitioning of awareness during traumatic states. Boyle recounted seeing combatants who, in spite of severe wounds, experienced moments of clarity that were beyond the realm of medicine. These events seemed to have persuaded him that consciousness was a separate phenomena that might be divided into several parts, much like bodily specimens. A troubling trend in Boyle's military career was also discovered by Hawthorne. According to Army medical records, a number of Boyle's patients had exhibited unusual post-operative conditions that attending nurses described as responsive yet absent. One report mentioned a soldier who had suffered a severe head wound and who, following Boyle's treatment, appeared to have lost all sense of self but was still physically animated and able to follow basic commands. Because combat hospitals are chaotic, the report was filed more as a curiosity than a concern. Although the identities of Boyle's companions were unknown, Hawthorne's investigation revealed a possible clue. Hospital records from Richmond in 1864 described a Dr. Boyle working with a nurse who was only identified as Ellen M. A number of patients remarked on their unusually close relationship, and one recovering officer wrote home about Dr. Boyle and his nurse companion performing examinations of an unorthodox nature after the senior surgeons had retired for the evening. Of particular interest to Hawthorne was a notation in Boyle's military file that he had been temporarily transferred to an unnamed Special Medical Research Unit during the last months of the war. According to reports, the team was entrusted with creating sophisticated surgical methods, but precise records had been destroyed in Richmond's fire. The fact that Ellen M. vanished from hospital records at the same time, as this reassignment raises the possibility that she went with him to this new assignment. The identity of the cabin's third occupant was still unknown. According to local stories, there might have been a number of reasons, including an escaped prisoner, a patient Boyle wanted to continue treating, or even a family member of the woman or Boyle. Whatever the reality, the identity of this person would play a crucial role in the unsettling revelations that transpired decades later. A chapter on the Boyle case was included in the monograph, Unorthodox Medical Practices in the Late War, which Hawthorne wrote after returning to St. Louis. Hawthorne removed the chapter, and his notes on Boyle were sealed among his personal papers until after his death in 1916. However, prior to publication, he received a letter from the Washington County Clerk warning that sharing information about the Boyle case could lead to legal action for disturbing public sensibilities with unfounded speculations. Although it remained undeveloped, the Boyle property changed hands multiple times in the years that followed. Crops planted close to the previous cabin site mysteriously wilted, according to local farmers, and cattle refused to graze there. Due to its reputation as unwholesome, the hollow was essentially abandoned to the growing forest by the turn of the century. If not for the events of June 1923, when catastrophic flooding in the White River Valley caused geological changes throughout the region, the Boyle case may have remained little more than a local curiosity. On what had been the Boyle property, a limestone sinkhole appeared, exposing a hitherto undiscovered cave system beneath the location of the former cabin. When his dog returned from exploring the opening with what looked like a human bone, local farmer Josiah Miller, who was the landowner at the time, informed the authorities of the discovery. When county officials dug up the cave's entrance, they discovered something gloomy. A larger chamber with evidence of past human habitation was accessible through the tight passageways. The walls were sculpted with stone shelves, and a center stone table was surrounded by rusting metal tools. The marks on the walls were the most unsettling. Intricate notations and patterns carved into the limestone that resembled medical pictures but had unsettling variances that went against accepted wisdom. Bone fragments were found dispersed throughout the cave, but no entire human remains were found. The evidence that the cave had been purposefully sealed from the inside, with big stones piled in what looked like a barricade, a distance from the entrance, was the most perplexing to the investigators. It appears that this barricade was in place long before the most recent sinkhole was formed, indicating that someone had at some point purposefully shut themselves inside the cave system. Citing safety concerns due to the flooding, officials promptly closed the new entrance. Only that unusual formations had been found on the old Boyle property and that the area had been closed to the public were mentioned in passing in the Fayetteville Democrat on the 14th of June, 1923. However, County Coroner Dr. Franklin Pierce briefly examined the bone fragments found at the site prior to the cave being resealed. His report, which was never published but was lodged with the county's archives, pointed out a number of irregularities. Pierce reported indications of drilling and the injection of foreign material into the bone structure, along with precise cuts that could only have been performed with surgical tools. His finding that certain pieces seemed to have been fused with an unidentified metal alloy and merged in a way that implies it happened while the tissue was still alive was the most unsettling. According to Pierce's report's conclusion, the bone fragments should be transferred to a university lab for a more thorough examination. Despite being of human origin, the fragments showed odd alterations. But according to county records, Judge William Harrison, who was notable for being the nephew of a Confederate veteran who had fought in the same regiment as Tobias Boyle, ordered the specimens destroyed instead, citing potential desecration of human remains. That may have been the end of the story, but in 1945, While working at the Washington County Archives, Dr. Margaret Holcomb, a historian who studied Civil War medical procedures, discovered the sealed documents of the initial inquiry. In her later work, which was published in the obscure Journal of Historical Appalachian Studies, she made a number of unsettling connections between the Boyle story. Boyle's military records showed that he had received 2 reprimands for performing unapproved operations on injured soldiers, Holcomb said. More importantly, she found a report from a Confederate medical inspector that Boyle had developed what he called unorthodox theories regarding human awareness during extreme physical states. The inspector suggested that Boyle be fired, but apparently no action was taken because of the dire need for surgeons in the final months of the war. Holcomb also discovered what might have been the case's most illuminating document, a letter to her sister in Baltimore from Ellen Morrison, a nurse who had collaborated with Boyle in Richmond. The letter, dated March 1865, conveyed mounting anxiety regarding Boyle's actions. "His interests have shifted from healing to something I cannot comprehend," she stated. The letter continued by mentioning a patient known only as Subject 11, whom Boyle had reportedly taken a particular interest in after suffering a severe head wound. He speaks of thresholds between states of being and methods to extend consciousness beyond what nature intended. "I fear his mind has been affected by the horrors we have witnessed. Yet, I cannot abandon him after all we have endured together." Holcomb speculated that Ellen Morrison was probably the E mentioned in Boyle's journals and that the 2 had fled west after the war, perhaps to continue Boyle's increasingly unsettling research away from scrutiny. T spends hours observing him, documenting every minute response. "Last night, I found him speaking to the patient about consciousness residing in compartments and how a properly prepared mind might be divided like segments of an orange, each maintaining independent awareness. When I entered, he grew silent, but his eyes held an excitement I have not seen since before Antietam. What's more," she said that Subject 11 could have been the enigmatic 3rd person in the cabin, a patient Boyle had somehow gotten out of military custody to use as a test subject. As a result of her research, Holcomb discovered documents from Richmond's Chimborazo Hospital, where Boyle had been assigned in early 1865. She discovered an entry in the medical logs for a soldier who was only known as Patient 11, who had been admitted with a serious head injury that had left him cognitively vacant but physically responsive. The patient was transferred to Special Research Ward on the 12th of February 1865, according to the entry, but there was no additional information about his condition or final disposition. Boyle's reassignment to the Special Medical Unit corresponded with this, confirming Holcomb's suspicion that Boyle may have taken this patient for personal gain. Finding a fragmentary transcript of an interview with Jeremiah Hawkins in 1889, just before his death, was the most unsettling portion of Holcomb's investigation. For decades, the old surveyor who had initially found the hut had not publicly discussed the issue. But Hawkins ultimately described what he had witnessed in the back chamber of the cabin in this private conversation with a local historian. "The jars contained things that had no right to be preserved," Hawkins said, "parts that appeared human but distorted in ways I cannot describe, and on the table there was a contraption of brass and wood with straps, as though to secure a person. But it was the drawings that disturbed me most to this day. Detailed illustrations showing a human form, with dotted lines dividing the body not by conventional anatomical standards, but in ways that suggested Boyle believed consciousness itself could be sectioned and preserved." Hawkins went on to describe sections of Boyle's journal that were not part of the official record. He wrote of consciousness as something that could be divided like slicing a fruit, with each segment retaining aspects of the whole. There were passages describing experiments, I cannot call them anything else, in which he claimed to have isolated awareness in specific portions of the body, independent of the brain. The most disturbing entry spoke of transferring these isolated fragments between subjects and of his ultimate goal, to achieve what he called distributed consciousness across multiple vessels. When asked why he hadn't shared these information with the authorities at the time, Hawkins responded, "I did. Sheriff Muldrow heard my full account, but the next day he informed me that certain aspects of my testimony would be omitted from the official report to prevent unwarranted hysteria. I was advised quite firmly to forget what I had seen and read. When I protested, the sheriff reminded me that spreading tales of such nature could be considered a form of public disturbance under county ordinance. Although Holcomb's thesis garnered little public attention, it briefly stirred much controversy in scholarly circles. Holcomb herself accepted a position at an East Coast university the following year and published nothing more on the Boyle case, and the Washington County Historical Society formally disassociated itself from her findings. In 1951, many of the original documents pertaining to the case were taken out of the public domain, supposedly for preservation purposes. In an odd epilogue to her role, Holcomb's personal documents, which were given to the archives of her institution following her passing in 1978, contained a sealed envelope that was to be kept sealed until 2025. As of this recording, the contents are unknown, and this requirement has been met. The dispute was forgotten until 1967, when geological surveys close to the old Boyle property were required for the building of a new roadway through the area. The cave system was found to be larger than previously believed by engineers, and it had been at least partially altered for human usage even before Boyle arrived in the region. Artifacts discovered in the deeper chambers were carbon dated to indicate activity that began in the early 1800s, which suggests that Boyle may have picked the site deliberately for its pre-existing subterranean characteristics rather than by accident. Under the direction of geologist Dr. Howard Ramsey, the survey crew recorded a sophisticated system of chambers that extended almost a quarter mile into the mountainside. According to what they discovered, Boyle had significantly altered the natural cave system to suit his needs. Certain compartments had been purposefully expanded, while others had been meticulously sealed, as evidenced by the chisel marks on the walls. The most fascinating was proof of an advanced ventilation system. Air circulation throughout the structure was made possible by thin shafts that were cut through the limestone to the surface. The team found what appeared to be a workshop space much larger than what had been shown in the 1923 study in the deepest chamber, which was only reachable by a short channel that had to be crawled. Channels that led to collection basins were carved into the surfaces of stone tables that were carved out of the live rock. According to Ramsey's official assessment, the markings resembled anatomical drawings mixed with electrical circuit diagrams, indicating a troubling attempt to integrate biological and mechanical ideas in a way that defies accepted scientific classification. Linguists and cryptographers then studied photographs of the symbols and came to the conclusion that, although its exact meaning could not be determined, they resembled a logical notational system rather than haphazard scrawls. The walls were covered in intricate markings, schematics, notations, and what seemed to be a sophisticated symbolic language unlike anything the team had ever seen before. Rusted pieces of metal tools were embedded in the cave floor. One of the more unsettling finds was a tiny leather-bound book that was discovered jammed in a crack and was presumably missed during the 1923 examination. Due to water damage, the journal, which was thought to be written by Ellen Morrison, only had a few readable entries. The most intact passage, dated January 1868, read, T. believes he has identified the precise moment when awareness separates from physical form. He speaks of capturing this instant, extending it indefinitely. I can no longer reconcile these pursuits with the man of healing I once knew, and yet the subject shows no outward signs of distress, maintains responses to stimuli. Perhaps there is truth in what T. suggests, that what we perceive as a singular consciousness is in fact divisible. Another partially legible entry described modifications to the cave system. T. has discovered that the limestone possesses unusual properties. He claims it responds to the resonance of consciousness, whatever that might mean. The chambers he has selected for different phases of the work are based on some principle of acoustic reflection that he refuses to fully explain. I have observed that sounds behave strangely in certain areas. Voices seem to echo in impossible ways, as though coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The subject mentioned was presumably the mysterious third resident of the cabin. The article implied that this individual was not a voluntary participant in whatever research Boyle was doing, but it provided no additional information about who they were. The last readable entry, which was severely damaged and only dated February 1869, included the unsettling passage, "Cannot continue as witness to this. The chamber below grows with his obsession. Last night he spoke of the ultimate separation, dividing his own consciousness as final proof of his theory. I fear what he intends for us all when." The rest of the page was destroyed by water damage, and no other entries were discovered. After being moved to the University of Arkansas archives, the magazine stayed there until 1968, when it was controversially removed as part of a collection rearrangement. We don't know where it is right now. Physical artifacts that were difficult to explain were also recovered by Dr. Ramsey's team. One of these was an incomplete apparatus made of wood, brass, and an alloy that metallurgical investigations subsequently determined to be exceptional because it contained elements not commonly seen in 19th century metallurgy. The apparatus, which was about the size of a human head, was made up of several concentric rings that were intended to rotate on their own and had tiny crystal formations positioned at exact intervals. Although its precise function was still unknown, engineers who studied the device hypothesized that it may have been made to produce particular electromagnetic patterns. The human remains discovered, buried in the deepest chamber's walls, were even more unsettling. These seem to have been purposefully positioned inside the limestone itself, in contrast to the dispersed pieces found in 1923. In his field notes, Dr. Ramsey reported discovering a human hand, remarkably preserved, embedded in the cave wall, as though the living rock had grown around it. Efforts to remove the remains for analysis failed because they seemed to have assimilated into the cave's mineral structure. In 1962, journalist Martin Clyde conducted a series of interviews with elderly residents of Washington County, which were published in the regional folklore collection, Shadows of the Ozarks. Several of the interviewees, who would have been children in the years following the Civil War, recalled stories their parents had told them about a strange man who occasionally came out of the woods near the Boyle property to trade for supplies at distant settlements. This gave rise to the most unsettling theory regarding the Boyle case, not historical records. These versions claim that the man only ever wrote notes rather than speaking. Locals suspected that he had combat wounds since he kept his face severely bandaged. One woman, Agnes Thornton, who was 94 years old at the time of the interview, remembered her father telling her about the man's appearance. He said, "When the bandages shifted, it wasn't like looking at an injured man at all. It was like looking at something incomplete, as though pieces that should have been there were missing. Yet he moved and functioned all the same." James Wilson, another elderly resident, related a story from his grandfather, who had met the stranger in 1871. Grandpa was hunting near Bear Creek when he came across a man sitting perfectly still beside a fallen tree. He called out a greeting, but the man didn't respond. When Grandpa approached, the man turned to face him, and that's when he noticed something wasn't right. The stranger's movements were too precise, too mechanical, and though his face was mostly covered, Grandpa swore that what little skin was visible seemed to shift in unnatural ways, as though what lay beneath wasn't quite settled. These legends suggested that one of the cabin's inhabitants may have survived the events of February 1869. More unsettlingly, they suggested that Boyle's experiments might have had some sort of effect, one that showed up as a physically changed survivor who stayed in the area for a while after the cabin was abandoned. An additional narrative in Clyde's collection gave the legend an especially eerie depth. Sarah Collins stated that her father had informed her about seeing odd symbols on trees in the forest around the Boyle property. Her father had been a member of the search party that was formed following Hawkins' discovery of the cabin. There was a significant difference between these markings and the anatomical diagrams that were later found in the cave system. They seemed to have been carved from the inside of the trees outward, as if they had been made by something inside the wood itself. In 1967, archaeological studies offered some tangible support for these stories. Researchers found a number of rudimentary shelters in the nearby woodland in addition to the tunnel system, indicating that someone had been living there nomadic for years after the cabin was abandoned. Fire pits and abandoned objects carbon dated showed occupation until about 1880, at which point there were no more indications of human habitation. Additionally, a number of trees with peculiar growth patterns and interior scars that match the markings mentioned in local tradition were discovered by the researchers. The internal structure of these trees had been changed in ways that were difficult to explain by either natural phenomena or typical human intervention, according to botanical analysis. The cellular patterns in the impacted wood, according to one researcher, resembled a purposeful rearranging of the living tissue, as if the trees had been trained to grow in specific patterns from the inside. A metal box found in one of these shelters provided the strongest piece of evidence. A handwritten document that has eluded conclusive authenticity was found inside. It is dated 1878 and looks to be a final testament or confession. The document continues in fragmented and frequently incoherent terms, a procedure carried out in the cave beneath the cabin, during which the writer claims to have experienced the separation of awareness from unified being. It implies that Boyle had somehow attempted to divide or transfer consciousness itself, with disastrous results for all involved. What remains of my original self diminishes with each passing season, while that which Boyle introduced grows stronger. Neither Ellen Morrison's recovered papers nor Boyle's journals fit the handwriting. It begins, "I who write these words am not as I once was. Ellen fled when she understood what had been done," the document states, taking with her the portion of Boyle that remained human. What was left of him pursued, driven by the fragmented awareness that could not reconcile its division. I alone remain, neither what I was, nor wholly what was introduced. The experiment succeeded and failed simultaneously. The text continues with increasingly disjointed observations, including references to the resonance of divided consciousness within the limestone chambers and awareness spreading through the living wood. Seeking reconnection. Most disturbing is the writer's claim that the boundaries between self and other have dissolved. I perceive from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The forest hears through my ears, and I see through its leaves. Division has become multiplication. The document concludes with a disturbing statement. I write this, knowing it shall be my final communication. The division grows unsustainable. Soon the remaining fragments will collapse into one another, and what emerges will no longer retain memory of its origins. Perhaps this is Boyle's ultimate success, the creation of an entirely new form of consciousness, born from the deliberate fracturing of three into something other. There is still much disagreement among the few academics who are aware of this document's existence over its legitimacy. Some people reject it as a complex fabrication, possibly carried out by locals to support the Boyle myth. The structure of the paper, according to neuropsychologist Allison Chambers, who studied it in 1969, showed that the mind was trying to integrate information from several viewpoints at once, which is compatible with some uncommon neurological disorders, where the integration of awareness is disturbed. According to her, if the document was real, it may be the writing of a person who was in a deep state of dissociation, either due to a neurological disorder or significant psychological trauma. The peculiar character of the human bone fragments found in the cave system is undeniable. Unusual drill patterns and markings from unidentified tools were among the fragments that showed evidence of precise surgical modification when they were examined in 1967. Traces of a metallic alloy were discovered embedded in certain parts, which was more unsettling since it suggested an early attempt to combine biological tissue with mechanical components, a process that was well beyond the state of medicine in the 1860 seconds. The alloy's composition, as determined by metallurgical investigation, includes common metals like copper and iron, as well as traces of substances that science would not identify until the early 20th century. In his report, the metallurgist who performed the analysis, Dr. Kenneth Foster, stated that the precision of the integration between the metallic components and the bone structure suggests a technological sophistication inconsistent with 19th century medical capabilities. The alloy appears to have been specifically designed to interface with living tissue in a manner that modern medicine is only beginning to explore. The team doing the geological investigation also noted peculiar characteristics in the cave system's limestone formations. The stone had unusual electromagnetic characteristics and crystalline formations that aren't usually found in limestone deposits. Dr. Ramsey noticed that several of the chambers had auditory effects that were hard to explain. Some sections of the cave appeared to absorb sound entirely, producing pockets of strange silence, while sounds created in one area would be more clearly replayed in farther off sections than in the near vicinity. The finding of what seemed to be organic material incorporated into the cave wall's mineral structure was the most perplexing. This sample contained human cellular components that had somehow been retained within the stone itself, according to biological examination. One of the survey team's biologists, Dr. Elizabeth Warner, reported discovering tissue samples that appear to exist in a state between living and mineral, as though the boundary between organic and inorganic matter has been deliberately blurred. When a university committee concluded in 1968 that the remaining material was too disjointed to warrant scientific judgments, the Boyle case was essentially closed. Since the cave's entrance was permanently blocked while the highway was being built and the records and artifacts were spread throughout other institutions, a thorough re-examination was practically impossible. Nonetheless, the tale endures in local tradition. On especially quiet nights, locals continue to report hearing strange noises that are neither completely human nor completely mechanical, coming from the wooded hills close to the former Boyle property. Occasionally, hikers report finding rudimentary stone shelters in the middle of the forest. They are always deserted but appear to have been recently abandoned. The accounts from construction workers who helped cover the cave opening in 1968 are arguably the most disturbing. One employee, a veteran military radio operator, identified the rhythmic pattern as Morse code, constantly writing out the same phrase. Division incomplete. Others reported hearing what sounded like deliberate tapping emanating from deep beneath the walled corridors. The region surrounding the former Boyle property has gained a reputation for strange occurrences in the decades after the cave was sealed. In the area, electronic equipment routinely breaks down. Compasses fluctuate in unanticipated ways. The forest itself exhibits biological anomalies that have drawn scientific attention, and visitors report experiencing a strange dissociation, which one hiker described as a sensation of observing oneself from multiple perspectives simultaneously, as though consciousness has been temporarily fragmented and redistributed. Unusual growth patterns in the plants surrounding the former cabin site were noted by botanical investigations carried out in the 1,980 seconds. While certain plants display what botanists refer to as non-local response patterns, where physical alterations in one specimen cause identical changes in distant plants with no apparent link, trees have symmetrical malformations that seem to mirror each other over great distances. Elevated quantities of specific minerals found in soil samples that are usually found in deeper geological strata point to some kind of continuous interaction between the cave system below and the surface environment. As part of a larger investigation on Ozark karst formations, geologist Dr. Sandra Martinez surveyed the region using non-invasive ground-penetrating radar in 2007. According to her findings, the 1,968 sealed cave system has kept growing, with additional chambers emerging along fracture lines that branch off of the original complex. Martinez pointed out that instead of happening over a few decades, such expansion would typically take place across geological time frames, indicating an accelerated process fueled by unidentified factors. Martinez's finding that the cave system seems to have grown traits that are incompatible with naturally occurring limestone formations was more unsettling. According to Martinez, the geometrically precise chamber structures shown by the radar imaging, perfect spheres, and connected cylindrical passages indicate intentional design as opposed to natural processes. Despite her well-established reputation in the industry, review committees rejected her attempts to obtain funds for a more thorough examination, citing methodological issues. Graduate student David Chen, Martinez's research assistant, carried out informal studies while trekking in the region. Chen reported finding a small crack in 2009 that seemed to lead to the sealed cave system. Chen's academic advisors discouraged further investigation of these findings, citing concerns about his professional reputation. He claimed to have used remote sensing equipment of his own design to detect organized electrical activity within the caves, regular patterns of weak electromagnetic pulses that, in his words, resembled nothing so much as the firing patterns of neural networks. After that, he reportedly moved to a remote part of Canada and left the geology program. I understand now what Boyle was attempting. The division of consciousness is not an end, but a beginning. What emerges from properly structured fragmentation is not less than the original awareness, but exponentially more. I go to observe the process firsthand. Chen has not been identified since his 2010 email, which was his last correspondence with colleagues. When Canadian authorities stated that Chen had lawfully established residence in a northern region and seemed to be living as a voluntary recluse, the investigation into his disappearance was temporarily started but later ended. Former co-workers have tried in vain to track him down. Dr. Margaret Holcomb's words, penned just before her academic career abruptly changed direction in 1952, may provide the most appropriate ending to the Boyle cabin narrative. The true horror of the Boyle case lies not in the possibility that his experiment succeeded, but in the implication that success and failure in such a context might be indistinguishable. If consciousness can indeed be divided, extracted, or transferred, then what remains of our understanding of human identity? Perhaps the most merciful outcome is that the evidence remains fragmented and incomplete. Much like one suspects whatever emerged from that cabin in the winter of 1869, the hollow is still quiet, save for the whisper that blows from the trees. However, people who know the tale of Tobias Boyle and his cabin occasionally assert that if you are standing in the exact right place, where the foundation stones are hidden beneath decades of forest growth, you may feel as though your thoughts are momentarily doubled, that you are looking at yourself from the inside as well as the outside. They claim that in that moment, you might comprehend what brought a wounded Civil War surgeon to this isolated location, and what horrible information he was trying to confirm in the midst of the Ozark Mountains. In a 2018 interview, neurologist Chris Henderson, who has researched cases of dissociative identity disorder, provided a concluding analysis of the Boyle case. What fascinates me about this historical account is not whether Boyle actually succeeded in dividing or transferring consciousness, but rather what the persistence of the story tells us about our own deep anxieties regarding the nature of selfhood. We cling to the notion that consciousness is unified and indivisible, because the alternative that what we experience as a singular I might be merely a convenient illusion is fundamentally threatening to our conception of humanity. Henderson went on to say, whether Boyle was a madman, a visionary, or simply a traumatized surgeon whose delusions have been magnified by decades of folkloric embellishment, his story touches on primal fears about the fragility of identity. Perhaps that's why the case continues to disturb us, not because of what might have happened in that cabin, but because of what it suggests about the precarious nature of what we call the self. The mysteries surrounding the Boyle cabin are still mostly unanswered as this tale comes to a close. With important records missing, witnesses long deceased, and the actual site changed by decades of intentional deception and natural reclamation, the fragmented evidence still defies logical construction. What is left is a gloomy possibility that a disturbed surgeon attempted to demonstrate that human consciousness could be similarly fragmented in the wake of a war that broke the nation's unity, with repercussions that still reverberate through the eerie silence of the Ozark Mountains. The land has now been reclaimed by the forest. Sometimes hikers find themselves standing on the remains of the Boyle hut, only to discover that the stone foundations are partially covered with moss. Visitors who stay too long report experiencing strange sensations, such as a heaviness in the air, a doubling of perception, or what one visitor called the unsettling feeling that something is watching me, watching myself. They leave quickly, taking with them only a vague sense of unease, and, if Boyle's theories were correct, perhaps fragments of awareness that are not wholly their own. The signs are still there for those who know where to look. Unnaturally symmetrical trees, Stones set out in patterns reminiscent of the schematics in Boyle's writings. And on especially quiet evenings, the distant sound of deliberate tapping coming from deep below the sealed ground. Division incomplete. That's right.